A pretty face and an empty head. That is what a man of quality desires in a wife, Prudence. Something you can provide neither of. Lady Honora Lockhart adjusted a silk flower in the vase on the mantelpiece, her gaze not on the bloom, but on her niece's reflection in the mirror behind it. A plain face, a head, unfortunately, quite full. Prudence Bellamy said nothing. She was on her knees on the cold library floor, her fingers smudged with ink, surrounded by the ghosts of 1,000 books. Her uncle was dead, his fortune was in tatters, and his library, his entire world, was being dismantled for auction. Her job was to catalog every last volume, every forgotten folio, every leather-bound memory, so that they could be sold to pay the debts her aunt had so diligently accrued. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. They only made the ink run. Her hands, however, were steady as she numbered another tag. Competence was her only refuge, precision her only armor. Her aunt continued, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "The Duke of Blackwood arrives within the hour. He is interested in the Sorrel Down parcel. Felicity will receive him. You, Prudence, will make yourself invisible." Honora's eyes finally met hers in the glass. "The Duke is a man of immense importance. He is not to be troubled by the sight of poor relations doing the work of clerks." Prudence's cousin, Felicity, was all the things Prudence was not. Blonde, buxom, and blessed with a laugh that tinkled like a shopkeeper's bell. She was currently being laced into a new French gown, purchased with money that ought to have settled the butcher's bill. Prudence thought of the unpaid bills, the anxious tradesmen in the village of Marley, the slow, creeping decay of her uncle's estate. She had a ledger of it all, not just in a book, but in her mind. She knew to the shilling how dire their situation was. Honora preferred not to know. She preferred to gamble on a single high-stakes throw, marrying Felicity to a man of title. And now, the highest stake of all was arriving. Gideon Devereux, Duke of Blackwood. A man whispered about in the county. War hero, widower, cold as the North Sea. His estate, Kestrel Chase, bordered their own crumbling property, and the 30 acres of Sorrel Down lay between them like a threadbare patch on a quilt. It was good land, meadow and light woodland running down to the river. It was also the last unencumbered asset the Lockhart estate possessed. Prudence knew her uncle had never intended for it to be sold. It had been part of her own mother's dowry, a fact Lady Honora chose to forget. "I will be finished in the west wing of the library by then," Prudence said, her voice quiet and even. "I shall not be seen." Lady Honora gave a curt nod, satisfied. "See that you are not." She swept from the room, leaving behind a trail of expensive funereal perfume. Prudence dipped her pen in the inkpot. Her hand was small, but her script was perfect. Clear, precise, and utterly legible. It was the only thing about her anyone had ever praised. Her uncle, a scholar who had loved his books more than people, had taught her. He had valued her mind, if not her presence. Since his death 6 months ago, no one valued either. She was simply a tool, a means to an end. An unpaid cataloger, an invisible accountant, a silent witness to the slow-motion collapse of her world. She picked up a heavy volume of botanical prints. Its spine was cracked, its cover stained. With gentle, expert fingers, she opened it, smoothing the brittle pages. She would save what she could. It was all she knew how to do. The distant sound of carriage wheels on gravel announced the Duke's arrival. Prudence did not look up. She simply turned the page. Gideon Devereux, Duke of Blackwood, was not a man who enjoyed social niceties. He had endured the Great War in the trenches of France, and had endured the loss of his young wife to influenza 2 years after his return. He now found himself in a state of perpetual, weary endurance. He had come to this crumbling house for one reason: the land. Sorrel Down would straighten the southern border of his own estate, Kestrel Chase, and give him control of the river access. It was a practical matter. Business. He was met by Lady Honora Lockhart, a woman whose desperation was as pungent as her perfume, and her daughter Felicity, a girl who had clearly been coached to within an inch of her life. She smiled too brightly, laughed too readily, and offered opinions on the weather that were both breathless and inane. Gideon's gaze, gray and flat as a winter sky, passed over her without a flicker of interest. He had seen 1,000 Felicities. He was immune to them. "Perhaps your Grace would care for a tour of the gardens," Lady Honora suggested, gesturing toward a set of French doors that revealed a landscape of weeds and neglect. "No," Gideon said. His voice was not loud, but it had a quality of finality that cut through the chatter. "I am here to see the land, and the survey maps." A flutter of panic crossed Lady Honora's face. "The maps, of course. They are somewhere in my late husband's study. Or perhaps the library. Felicity, dear, do you recall?" Felicity looked blank. "Maps, Mama? I'm sure I wouldn't know." Gideon's patience, a finite and dwindling resource, was nearing its end. "The library, then," he stated, and began walking in that direction, leaving them to scurry in his wake. The library at Bramblehurst Park was its only remaining glory. 2 stories of books, a universe of paper and ink, now layered with the dust of neglect. And in the middle of it, a figure on her knees, surrounded by stacks of ledgers and leather-bound volumes. For a moment, he thought she was a servant who had neglected her duties. Her dress was gray, her hair was bound in a severe knot, and her hands were dark with ink. He was about to deliver a sharp reprimand when he saw what she was doing. The tags on the books were numbered. A large ledger lay open beside her, its columns filled with a script so clear and elegant it was almost a work of art. This was not a servant shirking her work. This was an expert at hers. He stopped a few feet away. "You are the cataloger." Prudence looked up, startled. She had not heard him approach. Before her stood the Duke of Blackwood. He was taller than she had imagined, broader in the shoulder. A thin, white scar bisected his left eyebrow, giving his already severe face a dangerous cast. She got to her feet, brushing the dust from her skirt. "Your Grace, yes, I am. I require the 1815 Ordnance Survey map of the Marley Parish and the estate survey conducted by Abernathy in 1823. They should be in a portfolio of elephant folio size." Lady Honora and Felicity rushed in behind him. "Your Grace, please, don't trouble yourself with her. This is merely my niece, Prudence." Gideon ignored her. His eyes were fixed on Prudence. He had issued a test, a deliberately obscure request. Prudence hesitated for only a second. She thought of the tall, vellum-wrapped portfolios in the west alcove. "The Abernathy survey is not with the ordnance maps, Your Grace. My uncle kept it with his geological papers, due to the detailed notations on the riverbed substrate. I will fetch it for you." She moved to a dusty corner, her steps certain. She retrieved not one, but 2 portfolios, and brought them to the large library table, her movements economical and sure. She untied the ribbons and unrolled the heavy paper. "This is the Ordnance Survey," she said, her finger tracing a line. "And this is the Abernathy. You will note his measurements of the northern boundary of Sorrel Down differ from the Ordnance map by 22 feet along the riverbank." My uncle believed Abernathy to be the more accurate. Gideon stared at the map, then at her. He had known about the discrepancy. He had studied his own copies for weeks. He had not expected anyone here to be aware of it. He certainly had not expected this quiet, ink-stained woman to point it out with such calm authority. "Indeed," he said slowly, his gaze moving from the map to her face. It was not a pretty face, not in the way of her cousin's. It was pale and serious, dominated by large, intelligent gray eyes. He saw the faint smudge of ink on her cheek. He saw the absolute lack of artifice. "She reads books all day," Felicity said with a little giggle, as if it were a charming flaw. "Her head is quite full of useless things." Gideon looked at Felicity, then back at Prudence. A muscle tightened in his jaw. "There is no such thing as a useless fact," he said, his voice clipped. "Only useless conversations." The remark landed in the silent room like a thrown stone. Felicity's smile froze. Lady Honora's face tightened with fury. But the Duke's eyes were on Prudence, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt something other than numb indifference. He felt respect. It was a startling, unwelcome sensation. The sale of Sorrel Down grew complicated. Gideon's clear interest had alerted others. A man named Lucian Trent, a speculator from London with a reputation for sharp practices, had appeared in Marley and made a generous cash offer. Lady Honora was ecstatic. Fast money with no complications. She was prepared to accept it immediately, despite the fact that Trent was precisely the kind of man her late husband had despised. Prudence, continuing her work in the library, felt a growing sense of unease. She remembered conversations with her uncle about the land. He had felt a duty to it, and a duty to his neighbors. He had always said, "The Devereaux and the Bellamys have been neighbors for 200 years. Land is not a commodity, Prudence. It is a trust." To sell Sorrel Down to a man who would likely strip its timber and scar its fields felt like a posthumous betrayal. Her duty was to her aunt, her only guardian, but her loyalty was to her uncle's memory. The conflict pressed on her, a physical weight in her chest. One rainy afternoon, while clearing the last of the books from a concealed cabinet behind her uncle's desk, her fingers brushed against a loose panel at the back. Curious, she worked it open. Inside was a slim, japanned tin box. It was unlocked. She lifted the lid. Within lay a handful of personal letters and a single folded document tied with a faded ribbon. It was written in her uncle's hand, dated 5 years prior. It was a formal codicil to his will. Her breath caught. She read the dense legal script, her mind racing. It stated, in unambiguous terms, that in the event of the Bramblehurst estate needing to liquidate property, the parcel of land known as Sorrel Down must first be offered to the owner of the adjacent Kestrel Chase estate, at a price determined by the average of 3 independent valuations. Only if the owner of Kestrel Chase declined the offer could the land be sold on the open market. It was a thunderclap. This document gave Gideon Devereaux the absolute right of first refusal. It rendered Lucian Trent's offer invalid. Prudence sat back on her heels, the paper trembling in her hand. She thought of her aunt's delight,
of the plans already being made for a London season for Felicity. Giving this to Lady Honora would be fruitless. Honora would burn it without a second thought. The law, her uncle's explicit wish, her own conscience, all demanded she act. But to do so would mean defying her guardian and placing her own precarious future in jeopardy. She would be homeless, penniless, and disgraced. For an hour she sat in the silent library, the codicil in her lap. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she stood up.
She folded the document, placed it in the pocket of her plain gray dress, and walked out of the library. She had made her choice. She sent a note via a trusted stable boy, addressed to the Duke of Blackwood at the local inn. It contained a single line. I possess information material to the sale of Sorrel Down. I will be at the old footbridge over the river at dusk. She signed it simply, P. Bellamy. As the sun bled orange and purple across the sky, Prudence waited by the stone bridge. Every rustle of leaves made her start. She was risking everything on the character of a man she did not know, a man she had met only once. She clutched the small carved wooden kestrel in her pocket, a trinket her father had made for her long ago. It was her only tangible link to a time when she had felt safe. He arrived on foot, alone, appearing out of the twilight like a shadow. He did not waste time with greetings. You have information? I do, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. She pulled the folded codicil from her pocket and handed it to him. I found this today. It is a codicil to my uncle's will. Gideon took the document and read it by the fading light. His face was impassive, but she saw the quick, sharp intake of his breath. He read it twice, his brow furrowed in concentration. Finally, he looked up, his eyes searching her face in the gloom. This is genuine? The signature and seal are my uncle's. I have seen them 1,000 times. Why bring this to me? Why not your aunt? Here it was, the moment on which everything turned. Because my aunt would not have brought it to you, Prudence said plainly. She would have destroyed it. Mr. Trent's offer is more lucrative, and she requires the money immediately. But this document represents my uncle's legal and moral intention. I believe it should be honored. A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of the river. The Duke looked from the paper in his hand to the young woman before him. She stood straight and still, her gaze unwavering. She was not asking for a reward. She was not attempting a flirtation. She was stating a fact and presenting evidence, as if in a court of law. You understand what this means for you? He asked, his voice softer than she had heard it. Your aunt will not be pleased. I am aware, Prudence said. My situation in that house is no longer tenable, regardless. He folded the document carefully and placed it in his breast pocket. What do you want, Miss Bellamy? Want? The question surprised her. I want nothing. Only that the matter is settled correctly. Gideon stared at her. In his world, no one did anything for nothing. Everyone wanted something. Money, position, influence, favor. This woman, with her ink-stained fingers and her quiet, unyielding integrity, was an anomaly. She was not trying to curry favor or trap him. She was simply honest. It was as rare and as valuable as a flawless diamond. You have placed me in your debt, Miss Bellamy, he said. I have done what was right, she countered softly. There is no debt. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Nevertheless, I will not forget this. He turned and walked back the way he had come, melting back into the darkness, leaving Prudence alone by the river, with nothing but the cold night air and the terrifying, exhilarating feeling of having finally taken control of her own fate. The codicil, presented by Gideon's solicitor, had the explosive effect Prudence had predicted. Lady Honora was incandescent with rage, first denying its existence, then accusing Prudence of forgery and theft. But the document was undeniably legal, witnessed by her late husband's own lawyer. Lucian Trent's generous offer was nullified, and Gideon Devereux now held the exclusive right to purchase Sorrel Down at a legally determined price. Honora, however, was not without resources for spite. A loophole was found. While the Duke had the exclusive right to buy, the final price still had to be determined by a formal auction, open only to eligible bidders. In this case, just one. But Trent, a man of slippery legal talent, argued successfully before a local magistrate that any party with a pre-existing financial claim against the Bramblehurst estate should also be considered an eligible bidder to ensure the debts were paid. As Trent had cannily purchased several of the estate's largest debts from local merchants, he was now back in the game. The sale of Sorrel Down would be a direct bidding war between him and the Duke. Gideon was unconcerned until a report arrived from his man of business in London. A significant portion of his ready cash was tied up in a South American venture that had just collapsed, an investment made by his late father against all advice. He was asset-rich, but his liquid funds were now dangerously finite. The auction would be a close-run thing. He needed to understand the full financial position of his own estate, Kestrel Chase, and quickly. He needed to find every overlooked asset, every misfiled deed. He needed an archivist, an auditor, and a cataloger of unimpeachable integrity and precision. He thought immediately of Prudence Bellamy. He rode to Bramblehurst himself. He did not ask for Lady Honora. He asked for Miss Bellamy. Prudence met him in the hall, her face pale. She was holding a small valise. Her aunt had told her to be out of the house by nightfall. "Miss Bellamy," Gideon began without preamble, "I require your services. I will pay you a salary of £50 per annum with full board to put my estate archives in order. The work is urgent. It concerns the upcoming auction. I need an answer now." Prudence stared at him. £50 was a fortune. It was independence. It was escape. It was a position of trust and respect offered by the one man who had seen her worth. "Yes," she said, her voice clear. "Yes, Your Grace. I accept." "Good," he said. "My housekeeper will be expecting you. Your valise is packed. Is there anything else?" "No," she said. "There is nothing else here for me." And so, Prudence Bellamy left the house of her oppression in the Duke of Blackwood's own carriage. As they drove away, she did not look back. Kestrel Chase was magnificent, a grand Elizabethan manor of gray stone that commanded the valley. But inside, it was cold. The vast rooms were shrouded in dust sheets, the air was still and silent, and the portraits of Devereux ancestors seemed to watch with melancholic disapproval. It was a house in mourning, a perfect reflection of its master. The housekeeper, Mrs. Hannah Vickers, was a formidable woman with a stern face and skeptical eyes. She showed Prudence to a small, clean room in the servants' wing. "The Duke said you're to work in the muniment room. No one's been in there for 20 years. You'll have your meals in your room." The message was clear. You are staff, and you are on probation. Prudence was undeterred. The muniment room was a dusty, disorganized tomb of paper, but to her, it was a treasure chest. For days she worked from dawn until her candles burned low, fueled by weak tea and bread and cheese left on a tray outside her door. She imposed order on the chaos. She sorted deeds by date, cross-referenced leases with rent rolls, and created an index of such clarity and detail that the entire history of the Devereux estate began to unspool before her. She found things: a forgotten portfolio of canal shares, a misfiled deed for a quarry thought to be worthless, which her knowledge of the Abernathy survey told her was rich in limestone. Slowly, methodically, she was uncovering the hidden wealth of Kestrel Chase. But she did more than that. In her few moments away from the archives, she walked the grounds. She saw the famous gardens, once the pride of the county, now choked with weeds. In her uncle's library, she had read a book on landscape design by the very man who had designed them. On a piece of notepaper, she copied a list of the original rose cultivars and left it on the corner of the head gardener's desk. In the Kestrel Chase library, she found a handwritten book of recipes belonging to Gideon's late mother. She recognized the handwriting from annotations in the estate ledgers. She copied out a recipe for a particular lemon and rosemary cake and left it from Mrs. Vickers with a simple note. "I thought this might be of interest." Small acts of quiet competence, small gestures of care. A week later, the head gardener appeared at the muniment room door, holding a single, perfect white rose. "For you, miss," he mumbled, his cheeks red. "From the old Duchess's garden. We've found the stock." The next day, a slice of lemon and rosemary cake appeared on her dinner tray. It was still warm. Mrs. Vickers did not say a word, but when their paths crossed in the hall, the housekeeper's gaze was no longer skeptical. It held a glimmer of respect. Gideon observed it all. He would come to the muniment room in the evenings, ostensibly to review her progress. He would stand by the table, examining the neat piles of documents, the growing list of recovered assets. But their conversations would stray. She would ask about a name on a deed, and he would tell her the story of that ancestor. He would ask about a book she was referencing, and she would explain its historical context. He found himself looking forward to these quiet moments in the dusty room, lit by the warm glow of a single lamp. He was speaking more than he had in years. He noticed the way the light caught the few stray strands of her brown hair, the intensity of her focus, the quiet dignity of her presence. The cold, silent house was stirring. And so was the cold, silent man who owned it. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. The transformation at Kestrel Chase did not go unnoticed. News of the Duke's new archivist spread through the county, carried on the wings of gossip. At the forefront of this gossip was Arabella Sinclair, a celebrated local beauty who had long considered the Duke her personal property. That he would install a plain, penniless nobody from a disgraced family in his own home was an insult she could not abide. "She's a scheming little mouse," Arabella declared at a tea party, her voice carrying across the room. "She clearly forged that document to entrap him. Now she's living in his house, preying on his grief. It's utterly scandalous." Her words found fertile ground. It was a far more interesting story than the truth. Joining her in this campaign was Lucian Trent. Humiliated by the discovery of the codicil, he was now bent on revenge. Discrediting Prudence was the key to undermining Gideon before the auction. If he could prove she was a forger, the codicil would be invalidated, and perhaps the Duke's reputation would be tarnished enough to weaken his standing in the county. Their whispers escalated into a formal attack.
Trent, using his London connections, procured an expert opinion from a handwriting analyst who declared the signature on the codicil a clever but definite forgery. He presented this finding to a local magistrate, a weak-willed man indebted to Trent for past favors. An official inquiry was launched. The news struck Kestrel Chase like a physical blow. A summons was delivered, requesting Miss Prudence Bellamy to appear before the magistrate in Marley to answer questions regarding the provenance of a certain legal document. Prudence read the summons in the muniment room, the paper shaking slightly in her hand. For all her courage, she was still a woman alone, her reputation the only currency she possessed. An accusation of forgery, even if baseless, could ruin her forever. Mrs. Vickers found her there, her face ashen.
The housekeeper, who a month ago would have watched with cold indifference, now placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "It's lies, miss. Don't you mind them." But Prudence did mind. She thought of the Duke. She had brought this trouble to his door. She had involved him in her family's sordid affairs and exposed him to public scandal. Gideon was in his study when the magistrate, Mr. Ellery, paid him a visit. The man was sweating, despite the coolness of the day. He presented a copy of the expert's report. "Your Grace, I have no choice but to investigate. The evidence presented is compelling. The ink composition is inconsistent with other documents from that period in the late Mr. Lockhart's files. The pressure of the nib on the downstrokes of the signature—" Gideon listened, his face a mask of stone. He was a man who lived by evidence, logic, proof. He had built his life around tangible facts, not messy emotions. And the facts being presented to him suggested that the woman he had brought into his home, the woman he had begun to trust, was a criminal. A seed of doubt, cold and poisonous, was planted in his mind. Could he have been so wrong? Had her quiet integrity been nothing more than a masterful performance? The thought was a shard of ice in his gut. He dismissed the magistrate with a curt nod, promising his cooperation. Then he sat alone in his study for a long time, the expert's report on the desk before him. He thought of her clear eyes, her plain speech, her refusal to take payment for the codicil. He thought of the life returning to his house, the scent of roses and lemon cake, the quiet companionship in the dusty archive room. None of it aligned with the portrait of a scheming forger. Yet the report was there. Ink, pressure, science. Finally he stood. He would not allow the doubt to fester. He would do what he always did, seek the truth directly. He walked from his study, his stride long and purposeful, straight to the muniment room. He found her standing by the window, looking out over the darkening grounds. She turned as he entered, her face pale but her expression composed. She did not offer apologies or excuses. She simply waited. This was the moment, the crisis point where trust is either forged into something stronger or shatters completely. He could have been diplomatic. He could have hedged. He did neither. His nature was to cut to the bone. "Tell me plainly, Miss Bellamy," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of the house, the title, the entire inquiry. "Did you forge that document?" Prudence met his gaze. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This was the test. Not the magistrate, not the gossip, but this man, here, now. Her entire future rested on his belief. She could have wept, protested her innocence, sworn oaths. She did none of those things. It was not her way. She answered him with the same quiet, unadorned honesty she had given him by the river. "No, Your Grace," she said, her voice low but perfectly steady. "I did not. I found it exactly as I told you." She paused, then continued, her mind working with its customary precision. "As for the evidence Mr. Trent's expert has found, I can explain it. My uncle kept 2 inkwells on his desk. One was Indian ink for his architectural drawings. The other was standard iron gall for correspondence. He would often dip his pen in the wrong one by mistake if he was distracted. It is why many of his notations have a slightly different hue. As for the signature," she faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of pain crossing her face. "He suffered from gout in his right hand. When it was bad, his signature became more angular, the pressure less certain. The codicil was signed in winter. He was always worse in the winter." She had finished. She had presented her own evidence, her own facts, drawn not from a laboratory, but from memory and observation. From love, though she did not name it. She had laid her truth before him, and could do no more. Gideon listened, watching her face. He had come to the room braced for a lie. He was a man who could smell deceit. He had been surrounded by it his entire life, at court, in the army, in his own drawing room. He knew its shifting eyes, its placating tones, its frantic protestations. He saw none of that in Prudence Bellamy. He saw a woman under immense pressure, holding herself together with sheer force of will. He saw the flicker of remembered pain when she spoke of her uncle's gout. He saw the deep, unshakable certainty in her eyes. It was not the bluster of a liar, but the quiet resilience of the truth. And in that moment, the cold logic of the expert's report crumbled. It was just paper, just theories about ink and pressure. Before him stood a fact, a living, breathing fact. Her character. He had seen it by the river. He had seen it in the order she had brought to his archives. He had seen it in the life she had breathed back into his home without even trying. He had weighed the evidence of a paid expert against the evidence of his own senses, his own instincts, and the choice was suddenly, blindingly clear. It was not pity he felt for her. It was something harder and more respectful. It was admiration. He had trusted his life to men in the trenches with less certainty than he felt now. He gave a single, decisive nod. The doubt was gone, incinerated by a conviction so absolute it startled him. "I see," he said. And in those 2 words, the world shifted. The alliance of convenience, of employment, became something more. He took a step closer, and the space between them seemed to crackle with unspoken meaning. "We will fight this." He saw the tension in her shoulders ease, just slightly. He saw the faintest sheen of unshed tears in her eyes, which she refused to let fall. He felt a sudden, fierce urge to protect her, not from the world, but with her. He added 2 more words, and he heard their weight as they landed in the quiet room. Together. Together. The words settled over Prudence's raw nerves like a warm blanket. She had been alone for so long, fighting her battles in silence. The simple, profound solidarity of that single word was more potent than any declaration. She gave him a small, grateful nod, unable to speak. The inquiry was held in the Marley Town Hall. The room was packed. It had become the county's most riveting entertainment. Lucian Trent sat near the front with his solicitor, looking sleek and confident. Arabella Sinclair was there, positioned to watch Prudence's humiliation, a small, cruel smile playing on her lips. Lady Honora had also come, dressed in somber gray, the picture of a betrayed and grieving guardian. And in a prime seat sat Lady Theodosia Carmichael, the county's ancient, sharp-tongued dowager, her eyes missing nothing. The magistrate, Mr. Ellery, called the proceedings to order. Trent's expert witness was called first. He droned on about ink densities and microscopic paper fibers, presenting a compelling, scientific-sounding case for forgery. The mood in the room turned against Prudence. She could feel the weight of their judgment, cold and heavy. Then Gideon's solicitor called Prudence to testify. She walked to the front of the room, her back straight, her head held high. She spoke calmly, her voice clear and steady. She explained her uncle's 2 inkwells. She described his struggle with gout. She did not embellish or appeal for sympathy. She simply stated the facts as she knew them. Trent's solicitor rose to cross-examine her. "Miss Bellamy, you ask us to believe these convenient habits of your late uncle, but you have no proof, no evidence to support these claims, other than your own self-serving testimony." "On the contrary," a new voice cut in. It was Gideon. He stood from his seat. "We have a great deal of evidence." He gestured to a clerk, who brought forward a large box of papers. "In her work archiving my family's estate, Miss Bellamy has handled thousands of documents. In preparing for this inquiry, she and I reviewed my own family's correspondence with her uncle, dating back 30 years. He placed a letter on the magistrate's desk. "A letter from my father to Mr. Lockhart, dated 1818. Note the signature, Mr. Ellery. Angular, strained, and a postscript mentioning his damned gout." He placed another document down. "A note from Mr. Lockhart concerning a drainage ditch, 1821. You will see 2 different shades of ink in the same paragraph." He continued, document after document, building a mountain of corroborating evidence. He was not merely defending her, he was prosecuting the lie. Then came the final, devastating blow. Prudence had done more than just find old letters. During her deep dive into the Kestrel Chase archives, she had been searching for anything related to Sorrel Down. And she had found it. "And finally," Gideon said, his voice ringing with cold triumph, "a letter from my own father to Mr. Lockhart, dated 5 years ago. It had been misfiled with a set of unrelated tenancy agreements from the wrong decade. It took Miss Bellamy's meticulous cross-referencing of my father's journals to even know to look for it." He handed the letter to the magistrate. Mr. Ellery read it, his face turning pale. He cleared his throat and read it aloud. "My dear Lockhart, I am relieved you have had the codicil formally drawn up and witnessed. It sets my mind at ease to know that Sorrel Down will never fall into the hands of speculators, and that our family's lands shall remain bound by good stewardship. I consider the matter settled." A collective gasp went through the room. It was irrefutable. The codicil was not a forgery. It had been planned and acknowledged years ago. Lucian Trent's face was a mask of disbelief, which quickly curdled into fury. The expert he had hired began to stammer, backpedaling furiously. Lady Theodosia Carmichael raised her lorgnette, peering at Trent as if he were a particularly unpleasant insect. "Well," she declared, her voice carrying to every corner of the room, "it seems the girl has a spine of iron, and a memory like the Doomsday Book. You picked the wrong opponent, Mr. Trent." The inquiry collapsed into a rout. Trent was exposed as a malicious liar, his reputation shattered. The magistrate, eager to distance himself from the debacle, dismissed the case with profound apologies to Miss Bellamy. Arabella Sinclair, her face flaming with humiliation, slipped out of the room. Lady Honora sat frozen, her expression a mixture of hatred and shock. Prudence had not only survived, she had triumphed. As she stepped down, her eyes met Gideon's across the crowded room. He gave her a single, affirming nod. Together. The vindication was complete, but the war was not yet won. The auction for Sorrel Down was still scheduled for the following week. Trent, though disgraced, was still an eligible bidder due to the debts he held. His desire for the land was now secondary to his desire to see Gideon Devereux fail. He would drive the price up out of pure spite. Prudence returned to Kestrel Chase a local hero. Mrs. Vickers met her at the door with a cup of hot, sweet tea. The staff, who had once viewed her with suspicion, now greeted her with smiles. She had faced down the county's bullies and won, but her victory felt hollow. She knew the state of Gideon's finances. She knew the auction would push him to the very brink, perhaps beyond it. He was doing it to secure the land, but also to defend her family's honor, an honor her own aunt was happy to sell to the highest bidder. The thought was intolerable. She retreated to the muniment room, her sanctuary. She needed to work. As she was filing the newly authenticated documents, her hand brushed against a small, locked deed box labeled with her own mother's name, Eleanor Bellamy. It had been sent over from Bramblehurst with some of her uncle's other personal effects. She had assumed it contained old letters or sentimental trifles. Honora had never mentioned it. Curiosity piqued, she found a small key on her uncle's old key ring that fit the lock. Inside, she found not letters, but a portfolio of share certificates and a statement from a London solicitor. It was a small inheritance, left to her by her maternal grandmother, an investment in a fledgling shipping line that her uncle had managed on her behalf. According to the most recent statement, dated just after her uncle's death, the company had seen explosive growth. The shares were now worth a small fortune, nearly £8,000. She stared at the number, her mind reeling. This was hers, all of it. Her aunt had known. Of course she had known. She had been hiding Prudence's independence from her, keeping her impoverished and dependent. The cruelty of it, the sheer, calculated greed took her breath away. But that feeling was quickly replaced by another, a sudden, brilliant, audacious idea. £8,000. It was more than enough. She did not tell Gideon. This was something she had to do herself. The next day, she took the morning coach to the county town and paid a visit to the solicitor whose name was on the statement. By afternoon, she had taken control of her inheritance. She was no longer a penniless dependent. She was a woman of property. A woman with a plan. The day of the auction arrived. It was held on the village green in Marley. The entire county seemed to be there, drawn by the drama. Gideon stood at the front, his face calm and determined. Lucian Trent stood on the opposite side, a smug sneer on his face. He might have lost the battle of reputation, but he intended to win the war of finance. The auctioneer began. "We are here to sell the 30-acre parcel known as Sorrel Down. Bidding will begin at £3,000. 3,000, Gideon said immediately, his voice clear and strong. 3,500, Trent countered, his voice oily. The bids went back and forth, climbing steadily. 4,000, 5, 6. Prudence watched from the back of the crowd, her heart pounding. She saw the strain around Gideon's eyes as the price surpassed the initial valuations. Trent was bleeding him, forcing him to liquidate his victory. The bidding reached £7,000.
the absolute limit of Gideon's available cash, a fact Prudence had surmised from her own audit. £7,000, Gideon said, his voice tight. 7,100, Trent shot back instantly, a triumphant glint in his eye. He knew he had him. Gideon was silent. A muscle worked in his jaw. He could go no further without jeopardizing his entire estate. The auctioneer raised his gavel. 7,100, going once, going twice, £8,000. The voice was not loud, but it cut through the tense silence like a bell. Every head turned. Standing at the back of the crowd, her posture perfect, her expression serene, was Prudence Bellamy. Beside her stood her new solicitor. A wave of stunned disbelief washed over the onlookers. Lady Honora's jaw dropped. Trent stared, his face a comical picture of confusion. Gideon turned slowly, his eyes finding hers across the crowd. His expression was one of profound, utter shock. I have a bid for £8,000 from Miss Bellamy, the auctioneer stammered, looking at her solicitor, who gave a crisp nod. Trent was speechless. He didn't have that kind of money. He had been bluffing, leveraging his position to ruin Gideon, not to actually acquire the land at such an inflated price. £8,000, going once, the auctioneer called, his voice regaining its confidence. Going twice, sold!
To Miss Prudence Bellamy for £8,000. A stunned silence. Then an eruption of incredulous murmuring. The plain, penniless niece, the quiet archivist, had just outbid the Duke of Blackwood for her own family's land. She had saved him from ruin, saved the land from a speculator, and defeated her enemies, not with a whisper, but with a thunderclap of financial power. Prudence simply stood her ground, calm amidst the storm she had created, her gaze locked with Gideon's. In the stunned aftermath of the auction, as the crowd dispersed in a buzz of gossip, Gideon made his way through the throng to her side. His face was a mixture of emotions she couldn't quite decipher: shock, confusion, and something else. Something that looked almost like awe. Prudence, he said, using her first name without title or preamble. Why? She met his gaze directly. Sorrel Down was my mother's, she said, her voice quiet, but firm for his ears alone. It should never have been at risk. My aunt would have let that man have it, and my uncle's memory with it. I could not allow that. She paused, then added the part that mattered most. And I could not allow you to beggar yourself for the sake of my family's honor. The land is safe now. The trust is preserved. He stared at her, truly seeing her for the first time. Not as an employee, not as a victim to be rescued, but as an equal, a strategist, a woman of incredible strength, who had just executed a maneuver of breathtaking courage and precision. She had not seized power for its own sake. She had used it to restore order, to protect him, to honor the past. What will you do with it? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. It will remain as it is, she said. Good pasture, bordering a good neighbor. You may lease it from me, if you wish, for a peppercorn a year, or I will sell it to you when your finances have recovered, for the price of the original valuation, not this spectacle. She was giving it all back. The power, the advantage, the money. She had wanted only to make things right.
This was the moment that all his carefully constructed walls, breached by her quiet competence and steadfast honesty, finally crumbled to dust. This quiet, intelligent woman, who the world had dismissed as plain and penniless, possessed a spirit more valuable than any dukedom. She had seen him, his pride and his vulnerability, and had protected them both. "I don't want the land, Prudence," he said, his voice low and raw. The crowd had receded, leaving them in a small bubble of intense silence. "I want the woman who saved it. The woman who saved me from my own pride." He did not kneel. He did not make a grand, poetic speech. It was not his way. He simply stood before her, the great and powerful Duke of Blackwood, and laid his heart bare, with the same plain, unadorned honesty she had always shown him. "I am asking you to be my wife," he said, "not because you have money or land, but because you have integrity, because you have a head full of wonderful, useful things, because my house is only a home when you are in it. I am asking you to choose me." Prudence looked up at him, at the fierce sincerity in his grey eyes, and her own eyes finally filled with tears. But these were not the tears of sorrow and helplessness she had suppressed for so long. They were tears of overwhelming, unexpected joy. She had started with nothing, a disregarded girl on her knees in a dusty library. Now, a duke was asking her to choose him, not as a rescuer, but as a partner. "Yes," she whispered. "Plainly, Gideon. Yes." 1 year later, the Duchess of Blackwood stood on the crest of Sorrel Down, her hand resting in her husband's. Kestrel Chase lay below them, no longer a cold stone monument, but a living, breathing home, its windows glittering in the afternoon sun, its famous gardens a riot of colour. The scent of roses drifted up on the breeze.
Prudence had brought more than order to the archives. She had brought life to the entire estate. Mrs. Vickers now presided over a cheerful, bustling household. Lady Theodosia Carmichael was a frequent and welcome visitor, delighting in the Duchess's dry wit. As for their enemies, justice had been quiet but absolute. Lady Honora, exposed for hiding her niece's inheritance, lived in reduced circumstances in Bath, her social ambitions permanently extinguished. Felicity, freed from her mother's oppressive influence, had married a kind country curate and was, to her own surprise, deeply content. Lucian Trent and Arabella Sinclair had sold their local properties and vanished from the county, their names a cautionary tale. Gideon slipped a small, velvet-wrapped box into Prudence's hand. "A first anniversary gift," he said. She opened it. Nestled inside was a small, exquisitely carved wooden bird, its wings outstretched as if in flight. A kestrel. It was a perfect match for the humble one her father had carved, which she still kept on her dressing table. One was a memory of love lost, the other, a promise of love found. "To remind you," Gideon said softly, his arm coming around her waist, "that this is your home, that you are the heart of Kestrel Chase." Prudence leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart full. She looked out over the rolling green land of Sorrel Down, the bridge between her past and her future, the land she had bought not to possess it, but to protect it. She thought of her aunt's cruel words so long ago. A pretty face and an empty head. The world might value such things, but here, in the arms of this good, steadfast man, Her full head and her plain face had found their own truer worth. They had found their home. Together. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.